At my grandfather's funeral, while the chandeliers sparkled above the crowded hall and the scent of expensive lilies filled the air, my entire family sat in polished designer suits, their faces a mixture of fake sorrow and greedy anticipation. The lawyer's voice echoed as he listed inheritance after inheritance, millions in stocks, luxury properties, golden watches, and even shares in the family company. Gasps of delight and smug smiles spread across the room as my relatives leaned closer, counting their new fortunes in their heads. And then came my turn. My name was spoken, but instead of millions, instead of jewelry, instead of property, the lawyer handed me a small white envelope. Inside, there was no check, no deed, only a single folded piece of paper with one plane ticket to Rome. Silence fell for a second, then laughter burst out sharp and humiliating. My cousin Derek leaned back in his chair, smirking as he whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Guess Grandpa thought you were only worth coach class." My stepmother Catherine tilted her head with a cold smile, her diamond earrings flashing as she muttered, "At least now you can finally take a trip far away and stop embarrassing us with your teacher salary." My Aunt Sylvia pressed her lace handkerchief to her lips, pretending to hide a laugh, but her eyes shone with cruel amusement. I sat, frozen, my hands trembling as I clutched the useless envelope, my chest burning with humiliation. They had received millions, estates, and power, while I, Laura Bennett, a 31-year-old high school teacher who had sacrificed everything to care for my mother, was given a ticket out of the country like some unwanted burden to be shipped overseas. My throat tightened, but I refused to cry. I could hear the whispers behind me, relatives snickering, saying things like, "She should be grateful, at least she got something," or "Who needs a teacher in this family anyway?" My heart pounded like a war drum, not from fear, but from a rising storm of anger I had never felt before. I stared at the glossy mahogany table, at the greedy hands that clutched their millions, and I swore silently that this insult would not be the end of me. I did not speak a word, but inside I was screaming. And then, at that very moment, the lawyer cleared his throat, his eyes flicking toward me with a strange intensity, as if there was something more hidden in that envelope, something no one else in the room could see. They thought I was finished. They thought I had lost everything. But they were wrong. Because 6 words, just 6 simple words, were waiting to change everything I thought I knew about my family, my worth, and my future. My name is Laura Bennett. I am 31 years old, and I have spent my entire adult life in classrooms filled with chalk dust, flickering fluorescent lights, and the restless energy of teenagers who did not yet understand how much their lives were being shaped by the lessons I gave them. I teach English literature at a public high school in Ohio, and though the paycheck barely covered rent, groceries, and the mountain of medical bills for my mother, I poured my heart into it because teaching was the only thing that gave me purpose when everything else was falling apart. My colleagues respected me. My students sometimes slipped thank you notes onto my desk, and every June I watched another class of wide-eyed graduates walk across the stage carrying pieces of my effort with them into the world. Yet inside my own family, none of this mattered. To them, I was the poor teacher, the girl who could not get out of her small apartment, who wore the same navy dress to every holiday dinner, the one who did not deserve a seat at the table where real power was discussed. My father left when I was 12, marrying Catherine, the woman who would become my stepmother, a woman who treated me like an intruder in her polished life. She made sure I never forgot that I was an outsider. My cousin Derek used to laugh at my beat-up Honda Civic, calling it a toy car, and he boasted about his collection of European vehicles purchased with the company dividends he never worked a day for. Aunt Sylvia, with her pearl necklaces and holier-than-thou speeches about family unity, would pat my hand at gatherings and say in a syrupy tone, "Teaching is noble, dear, but you really should marry well if you want to matter." They believed money was the only measure of worth, and in their eyes I was invisible. What they never cared to know was that my invisibility had been chosen not because I was weak, but because life forced me into roles they could never have endured. When my mother fell ill, I was barely out of high school. She had no one but me. I turned down a full scholarship to a law program because I could not leave her. I took 2 part-time jobs, stacked my teaching certification classes at night, and somehow kept a roof over our heads. Every month, I stood in long lines at the pharmacy calculating how much of her medication I could afford, while across town my relatives hosted parties with champagne fountains. Every sacrifice I made, every sleepless night tutoring students to pay another hospital bill was invisible to them. They saw a failure where there was, in fact, strength. And maybe I let them believe that because I was too exhausted to fight back. My grandfather, however, was different. He would visit my mother and me quietly, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just sitting in my kitchen drinking tea. He once told me knowledge is power, Laura, but justice requires courage. He said I had both, though I never believed him. At his funeral, when that envelope was handed to me and the laughter filled the air, I remembered his words, but they felt hollow against the roar of humiliation. I was a teacher, not a lawyer, not a businesswoman, not someone who could fight the wolves in my family. Or at least that was what I thought. As I sat in that suffocating room, clutching the single ticket, I felt my identity shrink to the size of that envelope. Yet deep inside, a small ember refused to die. Maybe my grandfather had seen something in me that no one else did. Maybe the ticket was not an insult, but a door. At that moment, I did not know that the sacrifices I had made, the endless years of being underestimated, would become the very weapons that turned the tide. But the stage was set, and for the first time in my life, I would no longer be silent. The 3 faces that shaped the battlefield of my life stood out as clearly as if carved from stone. My stepmother, Catherine Whitmore, was the sharpest blade among them. At 56 years old, she had perfected the art of cruelty, delivered in soft tones and polite smiles. Catherine had married my father when I was 12, sweeping into our lives like a storm of perfumed silk and sharpened ambition. She never raised her voice, never cursed, but her words could strip me of dignity faster than any scream. She called me dear in front of guests, but when we were alone, she would glance at my textbooks, sigh, and murmur, "You will never rise above mediocrity, Laura. Your mother clings to you like an anchor, and anchors drown ships." Catherine had a way of making me feel small even as a child, and as an adult, her disdain only deepened. She treated my career as a teacher like a disease, something that might stain her manicured reputation if mentioned too loudly. She sat at family gatherings with her diamonds sparkling, sipping her wine, and reminded anyone who would listen that she had saved my father from a miserable first marriage. What she meant was that she had erased me piece by piece until only the outline of a disappointment remained in her eyes. Beside her stood Derek Whitmore, my 34-year-old cousin, a man whose arrogance seemed to grow with every dollar he inherited. Derek was the embodiment of wasted privilege. He had never worked a single day, yet he drove cars that cost more than my entire annual salary multiplied by 10. He wore tailored suits that clung to his gym-toned body, his hair slicked back his watch, always gleaming as if he needed the world to know how much it cost. Derek enjoyed mocking me. At Christmas dinners, he would ask how many essays I had graded that week, then laugh loudly and say, "Imagine grading papers when you could be signing million-dollar contracts." Once, when my old Honda refused to start in the driveway of my aunt's estate, he leaned against his Porsche and tossed me the number of a scrapyard, saying, "Maybe you should trade in your life as well." His cruelty was childish, but it cut deep because it was always met with the chuckles of others who thought the same. Derek's confidence came not from intelligence or talent, but from the knowledge that people like Catherine would always shield him, always hand him another inheritance, another chance while I was left scraping by with nothing. And then there was Aunt Sylvia, 62, the most insidious of all, because she wore her hypocrisy like pearls around her neck. Sylvia loved to present herself as the moral compass of the family. She spoke endlessly about tradition, family unity, and respect for our heritage. In reality, her sermons were nothing more than camouflage for her greed. She smiled sweetly at me during gatherings, patting my hand and saying things like, "Teaching is noble work, Laura. God bless your patience," while in the same breath whispering to others that I had wasted my life and that no man of worth would ever marry a teacher scraping by on pennies. She would host luncheons where she paraded charity donations in front of the press, but I knew she skimmed from those funds to redecorate her already lavish home. Sylvia's hypocrisy was like poison hidden in honey, and the family adored her because she made them feel righteous while she clawed at every dollar. The three of them, Catherine with her icy disdain, Derek with his arrogant cruelty, and Sylvia with her syrupy lies, formed a wall I could never climb. They controlled the narrative of who I was in the family. To them, I was the forgotten teacher, the spinster caretaker, the invisible shadow who did not deserve a single cent of Whitmore wealth. Their voices defined me at gatherings, their whispers shaped how others saw me, and their laughter followed me home like chains. When my grandfather died, their power only grew bolder. Catherine declared herself the rightful matriarch, her voice slicing through the air as if the crown had already been placed on her head. Derek strutted with a swagger that said he was ready to inherit everything. Sylvia prayed out loud at the funeral tears streaming down her cheeks, while discreetly signaling the lawyer to hurry with the will reading. I stood among them smaller than ever, knowing exactly how they saw me as the one who would walk away with nothing. They relished my invisibility, mistaking it for weakness, never realizing that every insult, every humiliation, every sneer was being carved into my memory, like lines of text in a book I would one day read aloud to the world. They believed I was powerless, that my chalk dust-covered hands and my tired eyes meant I was unfit to fight. But what they did not understand was that classrooms had given me more than lessons to teach. They had given me patience, resilience, and the ability to see through lies. And though I could not yet grasp it, those qualities would become the weapons I would wield when their empire of arrogance began to crumble. Long before the laughter at the funeral, long before the humiliation of that single ticket, my life had been carved out of sacrifice that no one in my family ever cared to see. I was 12 when my father left his shadow fading from the doorway as Catherine's perfume lingered behind him. My mother stood frozen that day, her hands trembling as she clutched the faded curtains, and from that moment I understood that the weight of her sorrow would fall on my shoulders. While my cousins were sent to private academies and summer camps in Europe, I stayed home cooking simple meals and folding laundry as my mother's health began to decline. By the time I was 17, her heart condition had worsened, and the doctors warned she would never work again. I remember sitting at our chipped kitchen table, the acceptance letter from a prestigious law program in one hand and the medical bills in the other. I should have celebrated the scholarship, but instead I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer I never opened again. I chose to stay to take care of her, to shoulder the weight that no one else would touch. I worked after-school jobs at diners, scrubbing grease from plates until my fingers blistered. I babysat children until midnight, stumbling into my own classes the next morning, half awake. I earned just enough to keep the lights on while across town, Derek threw parties where champagne flowed like water. They never once asked how I managed, never once offered help. In their eyes, my sacrifices were invisible. After high school, I pushed myself through a teaching certification program, juggling coursework with endless nights at the hospital when my mother's chest tightened and I had to call an ambulance. I became a teacher not because it was easy, but because it was the only dream I could still afford. The law degree slipped away like a distant horizon, but teaching gave me a different kind of power. The power to shape minds, to build hope for kids who reminded me of myself, stuck between dreams and harsh realities. Yet my family never saw it that way. To them, my job was a mark of failure. At Christmas dinners, Catherine would sip her wine and ask loudly, "How many essays did you grade this week, Laura?" as if the number would prove how small my life was. Derek would shake his head and say, I could never waste my time like that, as if responsibility was a joke. Sylvia would pat my hand with her saccharine smile and murmur, "You have a kind heart, dear, but kind hearts do not build empires." They built their empire on wealth passed down to them while I built my life on sweat, sleepless nights, and sacrifice. But none of that mattered to them. In their world, money was the only currency, and since I had none, I was bankrupt in their eyes. What they never knew was how many nights I sat by my mother's bedside, holding her frail hand, whispering stories from the books I loved to keep her calm. They never knew about the times I went hungry so she could eat, or the times I worked 3 jobs at once, rushing from the classroom to the diner to late-night tutoring sessions. My body ached. My mind wore thin, but I kept going because she needed me. I carried burdens no one applauded, and I did it without complaint. The invisibility became a shield, but also a wound. There were moments when I looked in the mirror and wondered if Catherine was right, if I had wasted my life, if all my sacrifices had led to nothing more than exhaustion. But then one of my students would slip a note onto my desk saying, "Thank you for believing in me," and the ember inside me glowed a little brighter. Those small moments of recognition were my secret treasures, invisible to my family, but invaluable to me. Still, when my grandfather visited, he seemed to see what no one else did. He would sit at our kitchen table, sip the weak tea I offered, and say, "Laura, you are stronger than all of them combined. They just cannot see it yet." I never believed him. I thought he was simply being kind to the granddaughter who had nothing. But when I held that plane ticket at his funeral, his words returned like a haunting echo. I had lived my life unseen, my sacrifices dismissed my worth, measured in the shallow terms of a toxic family. Yet maybe, just maybe, he had seen me all along. And if he had, then perhaps that ticket was not the insult everyone believed it to be. Perhaps it was the beginning of a reckoning, a path carved not by wealth but by every invisible sacrifice that had made me who I was. The day of the will reading felt less like a solemn legal proceeding and more like the opening act of a theater production where greed was the star of the show. The mahogany conference table gleamed under the golden light of the chandelier, its surface polished to a mirror shine, and around it sat the vultures dressed in their finest. Catherine wore a tailored black dress with a pearl choker that screamed wealth and control. Derek lounged back in his chair, his Rolex catching the light as he tapped impatient fingers, grinning like a man who already knew he was about to win the jackpot. Aunt Sylvia dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though her tears seemed as rehearsed as her Sunday sermons. I sat at the far end of the table, my plain black blazer pressed as neatly as I could manage my palms, damp, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. The lawyer, a thin man with spectacles and a voice as steady as a metronome, began to read. One by one the names were called, and one by one the fortunes were unveiled. To Derek Whitmore, my beloved grandson, I leave the beachside estate in Florida and the investment portfolio associated with it. Derek smirked, leaning back even further, nodding as if the words were confirmation of his birthright. To my dear sister Sylvia, I leave my shares in Whitmore Industries and the summer home in Vermont. Sylvia sniffled, her tears flowing on cue as she clutched her pearls, whispering, "He always valued family unity." To my devoted wife Catherine, I leave the primary residence and all accounts associated with its upkeep, along with full access to the Whitmore Family Trust. Catherine sat straighter, her cold smile widening as if she had finally secured her throne. The air was thick with satisfaction, the sound of pens scratching on paper as assets were tallied, numbers whispered like prayers. Then the lawyer paused, his eyes scanning the paper, his lips pressing into a thin line before he spoke again. To my granddaughter, Laura Bennett, I leave one plane ticket to Rome. For a heartbeat, silence held the room like a vice. Then it shattered. Laughter erupted loud and cruel, bouncing off the polished walls. Derek slapped the table, roaring with amusement. "A plane ticket," he howled. "You must be the cheapest heir in history." Catherine's voice sliced through the air, calm and sharp. "At least he thought of you. Laura, though it seems he only wanted you far away." Aunt Sylvia shook her head. Her lips curved in mock pity, murmuring, "A teacher with a plane ticket. How poetic." I felt my face burn as every pair of eyes turned toward me, some smirking, others pitying, none kind. My hands shook as I held the envelope the lawyer passed me, its weight feather-light compared to the heavy gold keys and deeds my relatives clutched. I wanted to disappear, to sink into the polished floor and vanish from their sight, but something inside me refused to bow. I clenched my jaw, staring down at the envelope, refusing to give them the satisfaction of tears. The whispers began immediately, cruel fragments floating through the air. She should be grateful, at least she got something. Maybe he wanted her to find a man abroad. Teaching will never make her worthy. Each word was another knife, and though I stayed silent inside, I was screaming. I thought of every night I had worked to keep the lights on, every sacrifice invisible to them, every ounce of dignity I had preserved. I thought of my grandfather's visits, his quiet eyes that seemed to see me when no one else did. Was this ticket an insult, or was it something more? My gaze flicked to the lawyer, and for a moment his eyes met mine. There was something there, a flicker of knowledge, as if he knew this envelope carried more than paper. My relatives leaned back in their chairs, giddy with triumph, basking in their millions, their properties, their jewels. They believed I had been erased, humiliated, reduced to nothing more than a girl with a ticket out of their world. But deep in my chest, where humiliation had burned, something else began to grow. It was not resignation, and it was not despair. It was fury, cold and steady, a fire waiting for air. I sat still, my lips pressed tight, while their laughter echoed around me. Let them laugh, I thought. Let them choke on their millions. Because if my grandfather had taught me anything, it was that justice often came wrapped in silence, waiting for the right moment to strike. And though I did not yet know it, that moment was closer than any of them could imagine. The plane ticket they mocked became the single most important object I had ever held. I boarded the flight to Rome with a suitcase of worn clothes, my modest savings tucked into my wallet, and the envelope clutched tightly in my bag as though it contained my very pulse. As the plane soared above the clouds, I replayed their laughter in my mind, the sting of Derek's voice echoing like a wound that would not close. They believed I was gone for good, exiled with nothing but humiliation. But the silence of the flight became a cocoon where another thought grew louder. What if this was not a dismissal? What if this was a test? My grandfather had never been careless. His eyes had always carried something deeper, as though he knew the family he had built was rotting from the inside. Perhaps he had left me the one thing that mattered because he believed I would see what others could not. By the time the plane touched down in Italy, my resolve had hardened. I stepped into Rome, the golden light of the city washing over me, the cobblestone streets echoing beneath my shoes. The city was alive with music, with laughter, with the smell of espresso drifting from narrow cafes, and for the first time in years, I felt something like hope flicker in my chest. The address, tucked inside the envelope, led me to a quiet street lined with stone buildings aged by centuries. My footsteps echoed as I climbed the marble steps of an office that bore the name Rossi and Associates. Inside, an elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes rose to greet me. "Miss Bennet," he said warmly, as though he had been waiting for me. "Please come in." He introduced himself as Alessandro Rossi, my grandfather's trusted attorney in Italy. We sat across from each other at a heavy oak desk piled with papers and bound files. He slid a leather folder toward me and placed a hand gently over it. "Your grandfather entrusted this to me long ago. He said you would be the only one with the patience and strength to understand it." My hands trembled as I opened the folder. Inside were deeds, contracts, and letters written in my grandfather's bold handwriting. I scanned the documents, my eyes widening as the truth unfolded. He had purchased a vast vineyard in Tuscany decades earlier, along with an estate that stretched across rolling hills, olive groves, and sun-drenched fields. The value was staggering, not only in wealth, but in history. It was a legacy rooted in soil and tradition, untouched by the greedy hands of Catherine Derrick or Sylvia. Alongside the deeds was a sealed letter addressed to me. I broke the wax seal with trembling fingers and read the words that made my breath catch. "Justice comes to those who wait." 6 words, 6 simple words that unlocked everything. Tears blurred my vision as I read further. He wrote of his disappointment in the corruption of the family, of the way greed had poisoned their hearts. He had seen me, the invisible granddaughter who had given up her dreams for duty, the teacher mocked for her modest life. He wrote that I was the only one who had lived with honor, the only one who valued more than money. He left me the estate not as charity, but as recognition. He believed I had the courage to protect it, to restore the Whitmore name, not with hollow wealth, but with truth. I pressed the letter to my chest, sobbing silently as the weight of his faith settled over me. All those years of invisibility, of humiliation, of sacrifice had not gone unseen. He had seen, and he had acted. Rossi watched quietly, his expression full of understanding. "Your grandfather was a wise man," he said gently. "He knew this family would devour itself if left unchecked. He believed you would be the balance, the justice." I walked the grounds of the vineyard days later, the sun setting over rows of vines, stretching into the horizon, the estate rising proudly behind me. My fingers brushed the rough stone walls, and I felt connected to something eternal, something stronger than the shallow greed that had defined my relatives. For the first time in my life, I felt not invisible, but chosen. Yet even as joy filled me, a storm brewed in the distance. I knew my family would not accept this quietly. They would rage, they would fight, they would demand. And I would be ready, because for once I had more than their laughter. I had proof I had power, and I had 6 words that burned in my soul like a shield. Justice comes to those who wait. My grandfather had waited his entire life to deliver justice to the family that betrayed him. Now it was my turn to carry that torch. I would return to America not as the humiliated teacher, with nothing but as the rightful heir, armed with the truth and with documents that would tear through their empire of lies. And when they saw me walk back into their world, holding the power they thought they had stolen, it would not be me who bowed my head in shame. It would be them. When I stepped off the plane back in Ohio, the air felt heavier, colder, as though the weight of what I carried was too immense for the world around me. In my bag rested the deeds to the vineyard, the contracts signed decades ago, and my grandfather's final words. I was no longer the invisible granddaughter who had been mocked with a ticket. I was the rightful heir to a fortune my family had not even known existed, and I had proof carved in ink and sealed with law. I did not rush to them. I waited. I let the days pass until whispers began to ripple through the Whitmore circle. Derek's new mansion had a lien on it, the Florida estate he bragged about was entangled in unpaid taxes, and the company shares Sylvia had been given were suddenly worthless as news of hidden debts came to light. Catherine found herself hounded by creditors, the accounts she had flaunted dwindling under the weight of liabilities my grandfather had cleverly concealed. Their millions were mirages beautiful until touched then, dissolving into sand. When the invitation arrived for a family meeting at the estate I accepted, I walked into the grand hall with its towering windows and oil paintings of ancestors who had built and squandered empires, and for the first time I did not feel small. Catherine sat at the head of the long table, her pearls still shining, but her face strained with the cracks of worry. Derek leaned forward, his bravado dimmed, though anger still flickered in his eyes. Sylvia clutched her handkerchief, her lips pressed into a line of false dignity. They all turned toward me as though I were an intruder, yet beneath their scorn was something new, fear. Catherine's voice was sharp. "Why are you here, Laura? Have you come to gloat with your ticket or to beg for scraps?" I set my bag on the table and slid the leather folder across the polished surface. "Not scraps," I said calmly. "Justice." Derek scoffed, reaching for the folder, but when he opened it, his smirk faltered. His eyes darted across the pages, his face paling as he read the deeds, the contracts, the signatures. "This is impossible," he muttered. Sylvia leaned closer, her fingers trembling as she traced the seals. "Where did you get these?" "From Grandpa," I said, my voice steady. "He entrusted them to me through his attorney in Rome. While you were counting imaginary millions, he left me the real legacy." Catherine snatched the documents, scanning them with narrowed eyes. She tried to mask her panic, but her hand shook. "These could be forgeries. No court will accept them." I leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "They already have. The deeds are notarized, the transfers recorded. The vineyard, the estate, the trust associated with them, they are mine." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Derek slammed his fist on the table, his voice breaking. "You do not deserve this. You are nothing but a teacher." I smiled faintly, though my heart pounded. "Maybe. But I am a teacher with proof, and proof beats entitlement." Sylvia's mask cracked, her voice quivering. "Laura, we are family. Surely you will not cast us out. Think of all we have shared." I thought of the years they had ignored me, the insults, the sneers, the laughter at my humiliation. I thought of the sacrifices I had made alone while they bathed in luxury. "Family," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Family is not about blood. It is about loyalty. And you have shown me none." Catherine's face twisted, her composure finally shattering. "You think you can destroy us. You are naive if you believe this piece of paper makes you powerful." But I saw the truth in her eyes. She knew she was cornered. She knew the empire she had claimed was collapsing, and I was holding the match. I gathered the documents back into my bag, rising to my feet. I did not need to scream or threaten. The law was on my side, and they could not twist it into their favor this time. My grandfather had ensured that. As I turned to leave, Derek's voice cracked with desperation. "You cannot do this. We will fight you. We will take it all back." I paused in the doorway, looking back at their faces once smug, now pale with fear. "Try," I said softly. "But remember, justice comes to those who wait. And I have waited long enough." The hall echoed with silence as I stepped out into the night, my heart pounding with the knowledge that the balance of power had shifted forever. They could rage, they could plot, but the truth was mine, and truth had the sharpest teeth of all. The weeks that followed the confrontation unfolded like a storm ripping through the carefully constructed illusions of my family. News spread quickly, whispered first in business circles, then splashed across local papers when creditors and banks began to act. Derek's mansion, once the site of parties that roared until dawn, was stripped of its luxury. Cars were repossessed, furniture hauled away, and the once gleaming facade now stood empty, a hollow shell of arrogance. He tried to fight it, of course, storming into boardrooms with threats and lawsuits, but every piece of paper he waved dissolved in the face of legal truth. The estate he bragged about was not an asset, but a liability drowning in debt. His laughter, once cruel and loud, became silence as he packed his designer suits into cardboard boxes. Catherine, who had strutted through life with icy poise, found her throne crumbling beneath her. The trust she inherited was tangled in obligations my grandfather had crafted with meticulous care. Every dollar she flaunted had strings attached, and when the banks pulled those strings, the accounts unraveled. I saw her once at a charity event, her pearls still at her throat, but her eyes hollow, her smile brittle as people whispered behind her back. The woman who had told me I was invisible now stood in the center of the room, exposed her power a memory. Aunt Sylvia's downfall was quieter but no less devastating. The shares she had clutched so proudly were revealed to be little more than paper, the company itself collapsing under the weight of mismanagement and hidden debts. Her carefully curated image of moral superiority cracked when donations she had boasted about were scrutinized, revealing inconsistencies. The whispers that had once elevated her now turned against her, and the same society women who once applauded her sermons avoided her calls. They all came to me eventually, though not together. Derek arrived first. His arrogance burned away, replaced with desperation. He begged me to help him, to loan him money from the estate I now controlled. "You have enough, Laura," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "We are family." I stared at him, remembering every cruel word, every laugh at my expense, and I felt nothing but clarity. "You mocked me for being a teacher," I said quietly. "So here is your final lesson. Actions have consequences." I turned him away, and the slam of the door echoed like justice. Sylvia came next, tears glistening in her eyes, her handkerchief trembling. "Laura," she whispered, "I was only trying to protect our family. Surely you can forgive me." I looked at her and saw not a victim, but a woman who had built her life on hypocrisy, feeding off others while cloaking herself in virtue. "Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting," I replied. "I will not carry hatred, but I will not carry you either." She left with her pearls slipping from her neck like beads from a broken strand. Catherine was the last. She did not beg, not at first. She came to me with her chin high, her voice still sharp, demanding that I share what was rightfully ours. "You think you have won," she hissed, "but you are still nothing without us." I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "No, Catherine. I am nothing without my students, without my mother, without the sacrifices that shaped me. But without me, you have nothing." Her mask cracked then, and for the first time I saw not a queen, but a woman stripped bare of the power she had wielded like a weapon. She left without another word, her heels clicking against the pavement like the fading echoes of a rain that had ended. Justice had been delivered not with shouting or vengeance, but with the quiet, unshakable force of truth and law. I did not need to raise my voice or swing a sword. My grandfather had given me the tools, and I had carried them with the patience and courage he believed I had. In the aftermath, I felt no triumphal gloating, only release. The chains of humiliation had fallen away, and the silence that had once suffocated me now felt like freedom. My family's empire of greed had collapsed, and I stood not as the girl with a plane ticket, but as the woman who had endured, who had been underestimated, and yet had prevailed. Justice came just as he promised, and it was sweeter than all the millions they had ever counted. In the quiet months that followed the storm, I found myself walking again along the cobblestone streets of Rome. The sun warm against my face, the weight of years of humiliation finally lifted from my shoulders. The vineyard stretched across the hills like a sea of green, each row of vines whispering promises of renewal, each stone of the old villa holding the memory of the man who had seen me when no one else did. I chose not to sit idly among the wealth I had inherited. Instead, I returned to the classroom this time at an international school nestled in the heart of the city. My students came from every corner of the world, their voices carrying accents and stories that wove together like threads of a tapestry, and each day I stood before them, I felt the truth of my grandfather's words. Knowledge was power, but justice required courage, and both had carried me here. Teaching had never been about money. It had always been about planting seeds that would outlive me, just as he had planted seeds of justice that outlived him. With the income from the vineyard, I established a scholarship fund in his name, dedicated to students who dreamed of education but lacked the means. For every note of gratitude I received, for every tearful parent who whispered "thank you," I felt my purpose grow stronger. The laughter of my family at the funeral had once been my shame, but now it was their legacy that lay in ruins, while mine flourished quietly, steadily rooted in truth. From time to time I heard of them. Derek moving from rental to rental, chasing opportunities that never came. Sylvia fading from society circles, her pearls sold off piece by piece. Catherine withdrawing into a smaller house. Her name whispered not with admiration, but with pity. They had not died, but the power they worshipped had, and without it, they were as small as they had once claimed I was. I bore them no hatred. Hatred was another chain, and I had broken free. Justice had been served and vengeance was unnecessary. My victory was not in their downfall, but in my liberation, in the life I now lived on my own terms. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the vineyard in shades of gold and crimson, I stood at the edge of the fields and thought of the 6 words that had carried me through. Justice comes to those who wait. My grandfather had waited a lifetime to deliver those words, and I had waited years to understand them. They were not just about wealth or inheritance. They were about dignity, about the truth that no sacrifice goes unseen, no act of integrity is wasted, and no injustice lasts forever. The world may overlook you, may laugh at you, may strip you down to nothing, but if you endure, if you hold to what is right, justice will find its way. I breathed in the warm air, the scent of grapes and earth filling my lungs, and I smiled, not for them, not for revenge, but for myself. They had millions and lost them. I had one ticket and it gave me everything.